everyone, or hello, or whenever you are watching this. I'm going today to sort of finish up the lecture on the Greeks, focusing on the Greek gods and the relationship between the human beings and their gods. And to do that, I want to click into Top Hat here and start from this particular statue. And this follows up with some of the themes that came up in the previous video. The emphasis on the male body, the nude male body, as a representation of both beauty and divine perfection, as you can see here in the statue of Zeus or Poseidon. It's unclear which god this was supposed to be. It is I should say the difference between the standard representation of the beautiful athletic male and what we have here in this image of Zeus is the beard. So the fact that Zeus and other gods, Zeus or Poseidon, and other gods generally have beards or are represented with beards. There are exceptions to this. The younger gods are exceptions to this. Reinforces this notion, matched with this divinely athletic figure, reinforces the divinity of the character we have here. But at the end of the day, this is also a very human image, engaged in sort of human activity as well. Here is not a god. This is definitely a human being, the Discobulus. Notice that he is captured in the middle of the act of tossing the discus. There is this concept of idealism as well, in that he has this perfect symmetry to his body, and also his face. And this is a component of the nudity as well, the representation of the nudity. His face, even engaged in this very strenuous act of, throwing the discus, his face is calm, it's stable, it's sort of reasonable. It's almost as though he is thinking the act of throwing the discus rather than engaged in the physical exertion. So the physical exertion is really not what the artist is reinforcing here. There is this concept of stability and sophrosine in these works that makes it idealistic. So this is a perfect human being who's in the act of throwing the discus. And that sense, that idea, this concept of perfection links these representations of human bodies to those bodies of the gods. But there's also an explanation for the, to not be too vulgar here, the flaccid penises that you see in every single one of these statues of nude males. That flaccid penis represents the intellectual themes of these works of art, that these works of art, or these people who are represented, or the gods who are represented, are spiritual, they're mindful, they have a spirit or a soul or a mind that is more powerful than their body and can kind of control their body. That doesn't mean that these are asexual statues. It doesn't mean that Zeus and Poseidon don't engage in sexual activities. They certainly do, as we'll see in just a minute. And then, of course, if you know anything about the Olympics, the Greeks are the inventors of the Olympics, and these Olympics, the sports, were done in the nude in order most likely to show off that powerful athletic body to the crowds. But there is a story. It's not a Greek story. It's a story about or it's a story from some Mongolian tribes. In Mongolia, there's this large sporting event, a wrestling event, where all of these clans come from around the country and they come together and their greatest wrestlers wrestle out in the field while the people stand around and cheer, etc. It's a standard modern sporting event. One difference is that all of the people who are wrestling are dressed in just loincloths. And it's not hot in Mongolia at the time this is happening. So the story for why they dress the way they do, rather than have regular clothes, so that they are not so cold, standing out waiting for the event to happen, is that in the past, some mythical past, there was a great warrior, back when they wore clothes to do the wrestling. There was this great warrior who won the whole thing, humiliated everyone that this warrior came in contact with. And at the end, after this warrior was crowned as the greatest of them all, it was revealed, and I'm not sure if the warrior revealed it or not, but it was revealed that this warrior was actually a woman. And so from that moment forward, the event had to be held in the nude so that no women could could be a part of the event. And the reason why you wouldn't want that is you wouldn't want the woman actually winning and then humiliating all of the men because of this concept of patriarchy. Is that the reason the Greeks are doing this? Well, probably not really. There's many reasons for the decisions they make, but that's just I think a fascinating story that offers one possible explanation for the emphasis on the nude male body in the Olympics, in the Greek Olympics. The Doryphoros is another of these. Well, this is one of the greatest works from this period, by an artist by the name of Polykleitos. It is there's a number of reasons to look at a work like this. I don't want to spend too much time on it. The perfection of the human body is really what we're after, and this highly organic feel of the body emerging out of cold, hard stone is also fascinating. We'll probably see him again in a bit. The Acropolis, this is the center of Athens where the worship of Athena happens, and that's the Parthenon there at the top of the Acropolis. The Acropolis is the name of the hill. And there are a number, there's art history reasons for analyzing the Acropolis. As far as the symposium, can kind of move a little bit beyond it, and you can read this on your own. You can read more about the Acropolis, and also watch some really great videos on YouTube about the Acropolis if you wish. I want to get into the gods explicitly in some of their stories today, and so that's where we are here. Now, if you've read all the way through the symposium, you will have seen that there are a number of references to the gods. There are a number of references to myths related to the gods. It's very important to remember that these myths for us are just stories. They are just things that you read to your children in PG-rated versions of them anyway, generally speaking. But we have to remember that for the Greeks, these are not just stories. These are not just, they're not myths like we think of the word myth, meaning untrue. They are true things. They are true things that happened in the past, filled with contradictions, filled with impossibilities, and filled with things that human beings cannot possibly understand. But that is the case with many religious stories. So these stories are almost equivalent to biblical stories for the Judeo-Christian traditions. I mean, we can assume that we're probably exactly equivalent to them, though the writers that we have writing about these gods and writing about and using these stories are a little bit less I guess you could say, religious to some extent than we may have in some contemporary literature on Christianity or Judaism, etc. But that does not mean that they did not believe that these stories were, at some point in the past, true. They certainly have meaning and have value. And one of the things that you should think about as you finish reading the Symposium and you begin reading Ovid is the way these stories are used in each one of these works. So the myths in the Symposium are used a specific way. They have Plato has a purpose putting these myths in the story. The myths for Ovid are also used in a specific way, and Ovid has a purpose for using these myths, but these purposes are distinctly different, and it signals the sort of the character of the two works as well. So you should pay attention to that. I want to start here with Prometheus and those pesky human beings. You may know some of these stories, and you can certainly read more extensively about them in a number of different places. I'm going to be very superficial with these stories. The first story, Prometheus, is that he is the god who puts together human beings, creates them out of clay. He liked human beings in many of the stories that have to do with him. So the one time that Zeus wants to kill all the humans by sending a flood, it turns out that Prometheus warns his favorite, one of his favorite humans, and his favorite human is able to put together a big boat, etc., etc. Very similar to the story of Noah, because it is probably, the story, if not the story of Noah, then the story that Noah was also built on. Most biblical scholars recognize that the Noah story is based on older stories out of the Mesopotamian region. It could be that this story of Prometheus comes from a similar source. It's always very unclear as to where these stories come from, but it is a very similar story. Prometheus also gives human beings fire, and that story shows the conflict between the gods. So, there are two different versions of this at least, and get used to that concept because, again, if you've read the Symposium, you know that there are two different stories for the birth of Aphrodite. There are two different stories, at least, for this event that happens with Prometheus. In one of the stories, he doesn't like Zeus and he wants to just cause trouble, and in the other story, he likes the humans and feels as though they are suffering because they have to eat raw meat. This story takes place at a time before human beings have left the gods. So there is a concept in many religious stories about some event that happens that alienates human beings from the gods and some godlike realm in which they lived. So you can see that in the Garden of Eden, for example, and getting kicked out of the Garden of Eden. For human beings in the Greek world, it wasn't a specific area. There are many different ways of calling that area something. I believe at some point the Elysian Fields was also this place where humans and gods hung out. But at any rate, gods were created as servants. Zeus, after he conquered the gods, he created the human beings as servants, and human beings lived at one with the gods. They were servants of the gods. They were very happy, supposedly, but they had to eat raw meat because the gods apparently liked to eat raw meat. And this is the story where Prometheus likes the people. And so Prometheus sees that the people don't like chewing the raw meat, and so gives them fire so that they can cook their meat. And that is a symbol, it's an allegory for giving them the basic fundamental structure of civilization itself, so they could manage the world on their own and not need the gods as much. And because of that, human beings get kicked out from this life they have with the gods, and Prometheus gets punished. One of the punishments for human beings, by the way, is the creation of Pandora, the first woman, and we'll talk about that story in just a moment. The punishment of Prometheus has him bound to a rock with iron chains, and Zeus disguises or changes himself into an eagle and descends every single day and eats out Prometheus's liver, and then flies away. And then, of course, because Prometheus is a god, his liver grows back, and the whole thing happens over again for all eternity. Well, until Prometheus finally gets broken away from this rock. But that's a later story. So the creation of Pandora obviously in many ways parallels the story of Eve, but in most ways doesn't. I mean, they are distinctly different stories, and it's a bit forced to say that they are identical stories. You have a concept that's the same, though, and that concept is that women cause problems. The problems are different for each one. And in fact, Eve's curiosity is a positive human trait. At least it would have been for the Greeks. They would have considered Eve, if they knew the story, they would have considered Eve being a curious person as being what all human beings should be, curious of the world. They themselves are becoming scientific. They are understanding the world around them in a scientific way, as I explained in the previous video. And so Eve would match with that. So her curiosity would be a positive trait, most likely. That doesn't mean that they wouldn't blame her for, the destruction of the relationship with the gods, because that's what happens in her story. Pandora isn't the cause of the schism with the gods. She's the result of the schism. So there's a fundamental difference. Even though both are related to troubles and chaos, etc., Eve is the causal agent, and Pandora is the result of the event. So that's the difference between the two. Pandora, apparently, according to the story, I think it's Hesiod's story, there were only men who existed before the creation of Pandora. So one of the reasons for creating Pandora was so that all the men would get jealous with each other and start attacking each other. Another reason was just to make her a bad person. The problem is that all the gods didn't agree with Zeus, and so many of the gods and goddesses especially were giving her positive traits, such as motherliness and kindliness and caring and emotion and beauty and things like that. That led Zeus to send Hermes. Zeus had already given her a trait. I don't remember what it was, but he sends Hermes to give her, as Hesiod writes, a bitchy mind and a cheating heart. And as I have here, these are Hesiod's words. This is not mine, because Hesiod was a misogynist. If you don't know what the word misogynist is, I'd recommend you look it up, or I can just tell you. It means a hater of women. And that's definitely what Hesiod was. Women are not portrayed very well in his stories. And maybe that's much of Greek culture may have been that as well. So she's born, she's created. Zeus gives her a present. And this is a fascinating component of the story, actually, because Zeus gives her this present and tells her never to open it. And of course, she did. And what's curious about this, and after she opens it, by the way, all of good in the world flies up into the heavens because it's very light, and all evil in the world stays on the earth, meaning that the earth is a fundamentally evil place. But there's also hope in the present. You can take that as you will, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. If it hung around with evil, maybe it's not a good thing for the Greeks. But what's interesting about this story is the misogyny sort of breaks down at this point, because, as I mentioned already with Eve, the Greeks were very curious people. They were very scientifically minded. They wanted to know how the world really worked. And the only way you can do that is to be curious and to experiment and open things that you're not supposed to open. And that's exactly what Pandora does. So it's almost as though there's a place for identifying with Pandora for the male society, this male-oriented society, patriarchy, very misogynistic society. In this story has a vehicle for identifying with the woman in the story, and not with the god, but with the woman as a parallel human being, first of all, but also as someone who is curious and like the men in the Athenian and the Greek world generally were curious. So it's an interesting aspect of the story that puts together this like I said, this vehicle for identifying with Pandora. Now you could probably find very similar aspects of the story of Eve, these moments of identification, but I can't think right off the top of my head, at any rate, I can't think of a moment of the story of Eve which is about male identification with her. So men are able to identify with her story in the classical Judeo-Christian tradition. There may be, I don't want to say there isn't. So that's seems to be another component of the differences between the two stories. So some of the themes that you get out of the story of Enkidu, which I did forget to do a little lecture on that, but you could read more about that story in Nicaean, in those chapters that I assigned you from Nicaean. So the story of Enkidu, and I don't know if Nicaean points this out very well, but Enkidu gets knowledge from sleeping with Shamhat, the prostitute. He gets understanding, is what it's called in the story. But he is no longer, after his creation, after his entrance into human beings, into being a human being, he is no longer able to really live with the animals like he did after his creation. Adam, fairly similar thing, gets knowledge from women, no longer able to live in the garden, at one with the animals, etc. The Greeks, a similar process, different points happen at different places, but a similar conceptual process, and that is gaining knowledge from outside. Someone gives knowledge to us, a god, and that's exactly what happens in Adam and Eve, by the way. It's God has, in the story, has placed the tree there and told them not to eat of it. So it's a creation of God. The same transgression has happened because Zeus very similar transgression. Zeus does not want humans to have that knowledge, just like Yahweh does not want humans, Adam and Eve, to have that knowledge. So there's a similar sort of conflict between the humans and the gods. Evil is associated with this knowledge, just like evil is associated with the knowledge that Adam gains. Now, these are distinctly different from the story of Enkidu, by the way. Enkidu doesn't have a transgression. Enkidu doesn't have the understanding is not an evil understanding. It's a good one. He was created in order to understand, so that he could go fight with Gilgamesh and they could become friends. And then, however, in every single one of these stages, human beings are cast out of that realm of the gods. So let's talk a little bit about Dionysus. And Dionysus is a god that we are going to return to when we get to Thomas Mann's Death in Venice, actually, at the close to the end of the course. His story is fascinating. He's the youngest of the gods. Another reason, by the way, that we're talking about Dionysus is because even though he's not directly, I don't know that he's not really directly mentioned in the symposium. They avoid him by celebrating God, the god of love, by celebrating Eros. They avoid celebrating Dionysus. As is explained at the beginning of the story, they're all hung over from the previous parties that they were at the days before, where they were celebrating Dionysus. And one of the components of celebrating Dionysus is to drink a lot. So they've avoided Dionysus and chosen Eros. But Alcibiades, the character who enters at the end, a drunken mess, could very well be kind of an allegorical image of Dionysus stepping on into this territory of Eros. But we'll maybe talk about that when we next see each other in the class, or hear each other, whatever it is. So, but let's get to his story. So Dionysus is the youngest of the gods, as I said already. He is, the stories about him are about his youth, about him being young. So one of the important stories is the story of his first love. There are no stories of the older gods and their first loves and how emotionally overwhelming that can be. So he connects with human beings more directly because of these stories in many ways. Because he's a young god, he's very curious as well, and so he travels the world and goes to different parts of the world and disappears for long periods of time. He is a very loving god to human beings. He wants human beings to be very happy, but he is also brutal in punishing you if you don't worship him in the way that he sees fit. And that brutality mixed with his love gives this almost a psychotic image of this god that will be very important when we read Thomas Mann later. So, firstly, the story of Semele. Semele is a human that Zeus is having an affair with, and Hera, the wife of Zeus, finds out about this affair, and truthfully that is the only reason that Hera exists, I think, in Greek stories, is to be the jealous housewife. She is always finding out about Zeus's affairs, the many, many, many affairs that he's having, and she is always punishing the human beings that he has affairs with, and the gods that he has affairs with, and their children, as with Hercules. So, with Dionysus, Semele is pregnant, but Semele does not know that she is having an affair with Zeus. But for one reason, the gods cannot appear in front of human beings as their self, as their natural essence, or human beings would be destroyed. So they disguise themselves in many, many ways as a human, in this case, some prince or something. So they've been engaged in this affair. Semele knows that she's pregnant. Hera comes to her dressed as a human, a human old woman, and tells her, so, I hear that you're having this affair with this really hot dude, and I've just been told, and I thought it was important for me to tell you that that it seems as though he is an ogre. He's not a human. And Semele starts to get kind of worried because she's pregnant. She doesn't want to have an ogre child. And so Hera says, okay, so here's the plan. This is what you should do. You tell him the next time he comes to, get it on with you, you tell him, hold on a minute, promise to do whatever I tell you to do. And so Semele says, yes, that's a good idea. And then once he agrees to that, then you tell him, reveal your true self to me. And because of magical things, he won't be able to resist, and he'll have to reveal his true self. Well, it turns out that that's true. Gods, when they promise something, cannot break that promise. It's like a natural law of the universe or something. Now, if they promise something to each other, that's not a problem, generally speaking. But if they promise it to human beings, then it causes horrible things if they don't fulfill their promise. So, Zeus arrives to Semele's house, and he's ready to get it on. And Semele says, wait. First, promise me that you will do whatever I tell you to do. And Zeus says, of course I promise. And then Semele says, reveal your true self to me. And Zeus goes, no. But he has to, and he reveals his true self, and it's lightning, and she's atomized, turned into a pile of dust instantly. Except for her fetus. So the half of her fetus that was God is not destroyed by his godlike presence. The half of the fetus that was human is destroyed. And so Zeus picks up the fetus, cuts open his thigh, and sews Dionysus into his thigh, where Dionysus continues to gestate, becomes a full human, a full god, and emerges from Zeus's thigh. So that's why he's associated with male fertility and potentially with a desire in the Greek world to have a way of reproducing without having to engage with women. That's this desire that sort of is repeated in Frankenstein in the 19th century. This desire of the patriarchy to be able to reproduce itself without having to go through the women for that reproduction and motherhood and etc. But outside of that, more of a psychological reading, he's associated by the Greeks with male fertility and a life force. Now there is another story of his first love, which goes to the divine nature of wine. Dionysus is the god of wine, and wine comes about from him falling in love with a young man, deeply in love, passionate love between the two of them. And Hera, I believe, is responsible for this as well. Dionysus goes away for a little bit, and a bull gores this lover to death. Dionysus comes upon the body, and overwhelmed with his passion and his love for the dead young man, he weeps tears into the pool of blood, and grapes grow out of that. So this relationship between his essence and blood is what wine is. Wine is sort of the essence, the spiritual essence of Dionysus, according to the Greek myth. The story also is important because of Dionysus and his emotions and weeping into the ground. Most of the gods don't have these emotions. They don't react in this way when human beings are killed or when anyone is killed, generally speaking. They're sort of sociopaths, except for Dionysus, who's more of a psychopath, I guess. There's a final story that has to do with Dionysus being ripped apart, limb from limb, shredded to pieces by the giants, the Cyclopes. And Zeus destroys them with his lightning. So again, purifying Dionysus again, in this act of purification. He gathers up the bits of Dionysus and I think he eats them. And then Dionysus is reborn out of that, sort of comes back together in the body of Zeus and is reborn. So Dionysus has lived, has died, and has been reborn. It's an important component of his story. But this ritual that goes along with worshiping Dionysus, called the orgiastic ritual, is one that involves ripping apart a living animal, often a goat, after the worshippers have worked themselves into a frenzy of drink and music, and the spirit of the god has entered into them in this frenzied worshiping and dancing and sexual activity, etc. And then the priest brings out the goat or whatever it is, and they jump on it and they rip it apart and they eat its raw flesh. That ritualistic rending of the flesh and eating it and drinking the blood of the god is called spiragmos, And it's actually found in a lot of different rituals around the world. Similar in some respects to the Catholic communion, Christian communion. Of course, there's no, music and drinking and dancing and orgies related to that, but it is for the Dionysian cult. This doesn't play that much in the symposium, and actually the symposium seems oriented towards directing that energy that's associated with Dionysus, that psychological energy or desire for trans for achieving a higher mode of consciousness. Let's put it that way, transcending the earth. That desire that's associated with Dionysus is something that the symposium plays around with. But the god himself, while maybe allegorically present in Alcibiades, doesn't figure that much into the stories. We'll return to Dionysus, as I mentioned, when we get to Freud and we get to Nietzsche and Thomas Mann's Death in Venice in the beginning of the 20th century. So, as the last bit of information here for this video, I want to talk about Greek sexuality. And one of the more important gods for the Greeks, important because he was in everyone's home. Everyone had a god of a little statue of Priapus in their home. And this carries over into the Roman world as well. Everyone had, I'm not sure if the Romans called him Priapus or not, but everyone had one of these statues or the important part of this statue around their home as an attempt at ensuring male fertility, and also that the gardens would be lovely. And this is Priapus. This is a Roman painting on the right. This is I think it's a Hellenistic period little statuette on the left, so a little bit pre-Roman. And as you can tell, his defining feature is a very, very large, outrageously large penis. This is the world of the Greeks. Now, you don't see this very much, if at all, in textbooks about Greek art, etc. These are not high works of art. They're not idealistic. They're fairly vulgar, but they were very, very common. And there are remnants of temples, probably Dionysian temples, where the major statues in the temple were all giant phalluses that you worshipped there, or that were worshipped by the people. So a Greek culture is a culture that worships, that elevates this concept of the phallus to a religious principle. And the phallus stands in for the structure and domination of the male hierarchy. There's another joke one. This is Roman. And then finally, a brief description of the state of women in the Greek world. And that is, there are several possibilities for women. You probably know this already, but Greek women had zero voice in politics. So in spite of the fact this was a democracy in a place like Athens, women were not a part of that democracy. So really it was just the men as the ones who ran that democracy. And in a place like Athens, it was even a smaller subset, because you had to be born to both an Athenian mother and an Athenian father in order to be considered a citizen, in order to be a part of this political unit. But so for women, a wife is one of the options. So wives, generally noble, but even middle-class women, very respected. They have no voice. They very rarely left the home. When they did, it was surrounded by a lot of servants. Now, these are upper-class women. Middle-class women would have had potentially some servants, but they would have been able to go around the city on their own, work in various places. And lower-class women and wives were often servants in people's homes. Prostitutes were, as you've read already, widely available. I'll leave that to the Reign of the Phallus. Hetairai talks also about, or the Reign of the Phallus talks extensively about them as well, so you should know about that. And then there was priestesses. So many of the cults and religions in the Greek world involved virginal women in relationship to the god. So the god Apollo could only speak through some women who were virginal, had never been touched by men. Those were the oracles. There's a suggestion that some of the mystery cults actually involved sexual activity between men and women, a little bit like the cults of Ishtar, or the worship of Ishtar, which in the Mesopotamian world involved having sex with the priestesses. We don't know much about those mystery cults, but there's some suggestion that that may have been the case. Most of these priestesses would have lived for a while as priestesses and then gone on to be married and to carry on their normal lives afterwards. Some of them were kind of wrecked by the relationship to the gods. So the oracles of Apollo, I think, always went insane after being the oracle. There's a chemical reason for that, most likely because the oracle was close to a cave that emitted gases from one of the volcanoes. I think that's the oracle at Delphi, and that probably was one of the things that led to the visions, and also would have led to long-term health consequences. So that's all I have for you today. When we see each other in class for the next lecture, we'll dive into the symposium and and do an analysis of the speeches that we see there. We're also going to do the quiz at the same time as we're kind of working through the symposium. So I hope you enjoy reading the symposium. I know some of you don't yet have your books. Just take good notes. I mean, obviously it's going to be a recorded lecture as well, but be there if you can for the lecture and ask questions to help get through a text that you aren't that familiar with. If you don't have a copy of the book, there are free copies available on Gutenberg. The translation is different, but you can at least get a gist of what is being said in the story. So I look forward to seeing you for the next class. Thank you very much for joining me.